This morning we have two speakers from the Mass Climate Action Network. MCAN is a nonprofit organization that ConcordCAN is a chapter of, and they have chapters throughout the state helping local groups work on climate action and also coordinate their actions towards state level action. And it's a great organization to be connected with. I happen to be on the board of MCAN, and it's been a great experience for me. And so we're going to hear from Sarah Dooling, who is the executive director of MCAN. She started about a year and a half ago, right at the start of the pandemic. And she has been doing an amazing job during a pretty challenging time and strengthening the organization's mission and programs, and in so many ways. It's been fantastic to be associated with Sarah. And she comes from Waltham originally, but she has been living for years in Austin, Texas, before she moved up. And that gives her a Texas can-do spirit, I think. And she has been working for many years on the equity dimensions of climate change and urban planning, and has a PhD in interdisciplinary urban design and planning from the University of Washington, I believe, as well as a master's in social work and a BS in wildlife management. We're also going to hear from Logan Malik, who is the Clean Energy Director at MCAN since 2020. He's been committed to working for a clean, just future for Massachusetts, and he comes from Western Mass originally. He has led the Municipal Light Plant Scorecard project and some great work about that he will be talking about. He's got a master's degree from Cambridge in England and in environmental policy. So I really want to welcome both Sarah and Malik, and really appreciate your working with us. And I'm going to change the view for the recording to be speaker view. Take it away, Sarah.
Great. Thank you, Brad. That was an unexpected and quite lovely introduction. Thank you so much. And it's really great to see so many people on the call this morning, so many names that now I can try to remember a face associated with those names. And it's great to see you, Jerry Frankel in particular, and Paul Schorb. We'll be talking later this week. I am going to share my screen, so bear with me for a moment while I set that up. And Brad did mention that I have been living in Texas on and off, and I'm calling in from Austin this morning, where the Carolina Wrens are really going at it. Okay. Now, let me go and present your view here. Now, can everybody see that? Is that clear to folks? Yes, perfect. Okay. Well, good morning. Again, my name is Sarah, and I'm the Executive Director at Mass Climate Action Network, and it's a real privilege for both Logan and I to share a little bit about our work. And in particular, this morning, I was invited by Brad to talk about the relationship between equity and buildings. And so today, I just want to be very clear. I'm not going to be doing a rigorous overview of the state's newly released draft specialized stretch code. Let's not call it a net zero code quite yet. But I am going to be giving a larger framework to think about different aspects of equity in a variety of building policies, including the DOER specialized stretch code that hopefully with your with your efforts and MCAN's other chapters efforts, it will become a net zero stretch code. Brad briefly explained Mass Climate Action Network. We are an advocacy organization. We really work with local folks. We work with a lot of municipalities, including folks in Concord, in thinking about home rule petitions for allowing the ability of municipalities to construct all electric fossil fuel buildings, for example. But we also then coordinate on state level actions. But local is at the heart of change. And that is kind of the MCAN's theory of change. It starts locally and it can grow and influence the state. So from a planning perspective, when we're thinking about why does racial equity, social equity, why does it matter? And the ugly truth is that in American planning practices, there are these racist histories. And this is a red line map. And I'll explain what that means in a minute from Haverhill. And so you can see here, if you track with my cursor, this is the Merrimack River. And then you see, this is a map of housing. You can see these blocks colored red in these various parts of Haverhill. Most of them are down by the river where they're probably flooded pretty frequently. And so this practice of redlining came about actually during the Great Depression. And it was part of an effort to keep households from defaulting on their mortgages. And the Roosevelt administration created something called the Homeowners Loan Corporation that offered favorable loans to certain kinds of families. And the corporation would hire real estate agents to make appraisals in cities across the country, including Haverhill and other cities in Massachusetts, and use that information to make these redlined maps. And the neighborhoods with heavy immigrant or Black populations, and even in some cases a single Black family, were deemed risky or hazardous. And so these are those redlined areas. And in contrast, these other areas tended to be the more all-exclusive white neighborhoods with higher quality housing stock and better performing schools. So the banks were also advised not to offer mortgage loans to people living in these redlined areas. So redlining produced these Black neighborhoods with the poorest quality housing stock and underperforming schools. And this has set up a long history of both divestment and intergenerational poverty. And so this is on the bottom of the slide here, there's a link to a WBUR article and podcast that is really well done. So I encourage you to check it out. So when we think about the built environment, when we walk through different neighborhoods in Haverhill, in Waltham, and maybe to a lesser extent, Concord, there are these legacies that still linger in the built environment, hearkening back to these practices of redlining. So MCAN, over the past year and a half, we have been leaning into centering equity in all of our work. And so I want to just briefly offer some definitional clarity about what these concepts mean, because equity can mean different things to different kinds of organizations and to different kinds of community groups. I want to propose, though, that we always lead with race. And this is because racial disparities, they are persistent, they are prevalent, and racial inequities have been perpetuated by practices like redlining, as well as cultural bias. And so addressing racial equity improves outcomes for other marginalized groups and builds capacity to address other kinds of inequities. And the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, I have a link to their resource at the end of this presentation. It's a great resource that gives an overview. And they argue that leading with race is critical to address the impact that a long history of redlining has generated. So always lead with race when we're thinking about the DOER specialized code. the implications of that for Black homeowners, Black low-income renters. So I want to briefly go over 4 types of equity. And the first one is often referred to as procedural, right? And this is the procedural equity is about creating an inclusive, accessible engagement and representation in a process around either developing a specialized stretch code or developing a climate action plan. And so it really is about making sure that everyone is at the table, but especially those people that have not been historically invited to the table. The second form of equity is distributional, thinking about how programs and policies generate fair distributions of benefits and burdens. So we're talking about benefits and burdens. Structural equity, refers to how decision makers institutionalize accountability. So when you think about the recently approved, the Department of Public Utilities recent approval of the Mass Save the next 3-year plan, energy efficiency plan, and how they weakened some of the tracking of how environmental justice communities would receive or have access to programs. And so that weakening of tracking is in a way a move back from being accountable. So we want more accountability on the part of our government, on the part of advocacy groups like MCAN. So that's really important. And the last one refers to transgenerational equity, that we have to think about how decisions, processes, policies, and programs are going to impact people in the future and not create intentionally or unintentionally burdens that can be otherwise avoided. So when you think about buildings and you think about building code or the home rule petitions, I offer for this, for ConcordCAN, to start having conversations that begin with, is everyone at the table? How are benefits and burdens being distributed? Are we being accountable? And are we taking into account future burdens and future risks? Equity also, though, can be thought of as a practice. Okay, and really it begins with making impacted communities central to the development of a net zero stretch code, a climate action plan. And it really comes down to, I offer, understanding the who of buildings. And from MCAN's perspective, from my perspective, as MCAN is gearing up to address the DOER draft specialized code, really thinking about putting people back into the code as opposed to focusing on the code itself. It also means, as a practice, really looking upstream and trying to think about how, as a group of community advocates, how your work can address some of the root causes of inequities, wealth generation, for example, and then really thinking about laying a foundation for equitable decision-making and putting into place measures that increase being accountable to your neighbors, to the town, to other stakeholders that you engage with. And this last point is really critical, and it's something that decision makers oftentimes don't really grasp, that tying success, whether it's success related to something coming out of the Concord MLP or the climate action plan, but tying success directly to what measure of equity you are focusing on, procedural, distributional, et cetera. So this is something that MCAN is really leaning into. We are learning as we go. We're not perfect in any way. What really guides centering equity is having a very clear purpose about the role of government, and that from MCAN's perspective, government has a duty to repair harm. And specifically in the context of the built environment and in the context of energy, Government has a duty to reduce the economic hardship for Black and brown ratepayers that are energy burdened, as well as, on the flip side, increasing access to all of the benefits of clean energy. So government has a duty to repair harm. Government also has a duty to be intentional about impact, right? And again, developing those measures to allow for a transparent accountability of how progress is being made. So what does that mean in the context of something like a retrofits program? Retrofits, and all of the conversations I've had with communities across the state, retrofits are the biggest challenge for the energy transition, at the scale of the renter or the homeowner or the landlord. And so when MCAN thinks about retrofits in our work, we start with asking questions. How can people who have been utility burdened, who are low income, living in communities that are designated as environmental justice communities based on income, race, and lack of English language proficiency, how can those ratepayers be prioritized in retrofits programs? And so MCAN, we partnered with Environment Mass and worked with Rep. Higgins on a retrofits program for gateway cities in Massachusetts. That was recently given $6.5 million from a combination of earmarks and ARPA funds, American Rescue Plan Act funds. These are federal funds coming into Massachusetts. And so that Gateway Cities retrofits program is targeting low-income ratepayers in gateway cities. So how to prioritize people who have been excluded and who can then now be the focus of receiving the benefits. But how are they going to receive these benefits, right? And how can local governments make sure that these retrofits, for example, are done very carefully, so that at the end of the day, when somebody turns on when the air source heat pump kicks on, that at the end of that electric bill cycle, they're not paying more for their utilities than they did pre-retrofit. So in other words, this is an ecosystem approach that really also depends on skilled technical labor to do a retrofit in a precise, coordinated, sequential way that ensures that the utility bills reduce over time after retrofits. So again, really having a clear enough idea of what success looks like depends on both short-term goals and long-term goals. And again, sticking with this example of retrofits, the short-term outcomes can be health-related. The other short-term outcomes can be reduced operational costs, especially for low-income renters. The long-term, for retrofits specifically, is that there are no displacement pressures created. This is hard, right? And in addition, there are no selling of these retrofitted units to corporations that live outside of your community. And I was on the phone with folks in Lawrence, and they said 48% of the landlords in Lawrence are from outside Lawrence. So this is very interesting and kind of an interesting challenge. I do want to briefly touch on the DOER's, the Department of Energy Resources release of its initial draft of a net zero stretch code, net zero. And again, I'm not doing an overall summary here. This is, so it was released last Tuesday, a week ago. That's right. And this is a slide from their slide deck. And I just want to highlight one pathway that has been proposed by DOER. And that pathway is for small residential buildings, 1 to 4 units. And it does include, at this point, it does include the ability of these newly constructed small residential units to be built with fossil fuel hookups and be powered by fossil fuels. And so when we think about a building code that is, for example, intended to improve the health of folks that have been have been part of the legacies of redlining that live near polluting arterials or other kinds of polluting facilities that, having a pathway that allows for fossil fuel on-site combustion just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, independent of the emissions targets. So this particular pathway for the DOER stretch code is problematic, despite there being a solar PV requirement and despite there being the requirement for pre-wiring for future electrification. This is just a retrofit waiting to happen. And just one more note about the DOER proposed specialized stretch code. There are no energy reporting requirements, no commissioning. So how are we going to track progress in terms of how are these buildings performing in the way that we want them to perform? So just very briefly, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. Gas stoves pollute. You all know this. You all wrote the home rule petition, but this is from somebody I follow on Twitter, just to give a sense of the level of indoor pollution that is generated when you turn on a gas cook stove. So the dotted line, if you can track my mouse here, this is the average this was the month of December, I believe. So that's the average. And you can see these peaks. That's when the cook stove is turned on. And the scale on the left is parts per billion, ranging from 0 to about just under 80. And this valley right here, that's when they did not turn the cook stove on, right? So there's a real difference in the amount, in the level of detected NOx. And according to this person, the daily average, here, let me move my tiles here. The daily average hovered around 2 times the World Health Organization's guideline. So I often talk about these cook stoves as basically a gas-powered plant in your house without proper scrubbers, without proper pollution controls. Here we are, here he was cooking dinner here. And for every 16 parts per billion increase in pollution levels, this is comparable to increasing exposure to a gas stove. The odds of respiratory illness in children go up about 20%. So this is a health issue. So MCAN often leads with health when we talk about the built environment. So very big overarching framework I want to offer people today is this idea of equitable decarbonization. What the heck does it mean? And I've given some overview of some definitional, some definitions to help organize thoughts. I do want to emphasize that something like a building code is inefficient, and it is not able to address all of the equitable dimensions of the built environment, that it is part of this larger platform. And so in Concord, as you all think about the home rule petition, I encourage you to also think about your housing production plan. There's a way to bring in some requirements around the future construction of affordable housing that meets net zero standards. But I also encourage ConcordCAN to think about how might the tracking of multifamily units be part of, for example, a climate action plan, a revised climate action plan, and how might the MLP work on implementing something like this. And so really coordinating plans, policies, and programs within your municipality is one way to really make sure that the different aspects of equity are kind of baked in throughout. My last slide, this is a list of resources. How bad is my gas stove? That's from the Twitter thread that showed the NOx pollution levels. I really encourage folks to read the Urban Sustainability Director Network's Equity in Buildings Framework. I took a lot of my comments today from this publication. And then this is a study that was done in Minnesota that really centers, that thinks about they call it a better building code that centers vulnerable low-income renters in multifamily housing as a way of assessing a building code. Lastly, I have developed terms that MCAN uses based in the literature that differentiate different kinds of equity that I have offered this morning. And we use that in our deliberations, and we use that in our campaign planning. With that, I thank you all for listening, and I am going to stop sharing my screen, and I am going to give the microphone to Logan. And I think maybe we can hold questions until both of us have presented. How does that sound, Brad?
That sounds perfect.
Okay, let me stop sharing.
Anybody can put a question in the chat as a way of seeding the question list. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that important framing. And I think while this presentation that I'm about to begin will be a little bit different and a little bit more focused specifically on Concord, I think that the framework that Sarah has provided specifically around equity is really important, as she said, not only in thinking about buildings, but in thinking about all types of climate action and how all levels of government should be working to address the climate crisis. So as Brad said, my name is Logan. I'm the Clean Energy Director at MCAN. And in my role, one of my primary responsibilities is working on our Municipal Light Plant effort, and our effort specifically focused on transitioning municipal light plants to clean energy and to a just energy future. And so I'm going to begin just by talking about what the scorecard is, what we did, and then how Concord scored in that, and what some of the key takeaways are, not generally, but specifically for Concord and for you all on this call today. So the scorecard is part of our broader effort to support residents and advocates in municipal light plants and in MLP communities to understand, what efforts are currently taking place to address the climate crisis, both in your community and across MLPs, with the goal of, learning from that and then continuing to take action, continuing to build on what progress has already been done. This is the second iteration of the scorecard, the 2021 MLP scorecard. It came out in September. And it really sought to expand on the previous version, which came out in 2019. And it does so both in increasing its level of information covered. It really tries to be comprehensive in the information it covers, as well as increasing the level of detail in the analysis and in the actual methodology that we use to score municipal light plants. And so what we did is we monitored MLPs, all 40 of the municipal light plants across the state, in their progress in addressing or in these four areas. So the first is energy transition. And we, had 50 points allocated to energy transition, energy efficiency, which was worth 25 points, transparency and community engagement worth 15 points, and policy context, which is how your community and specifically your government is establishing a climate-friendly policy context. And I can get into a little bit about what exactly that means later on in the presentation. As you see, those points, you may have added it up, but it makes up 100 points in total. So that was what MLPs could score. They could score up to 100 points. However, we also included significant amount of bonus points, 21 plus. So even if an MLP scored 100 points, that doesn't mean that there's still not progress that can be made. In fact, there's plenty of room for continued progress and continued efforts. And I think you'll find that that's particularly relevant for Concord. And so, out of these various different points, we measured progress, and we came up with a total number, basically scores. And we also ranked MLPs based specifically on those scores. I'm not going to talk too much about this. And, this is all available on our website. So you'll be able to kind of view these and look at exactly where each MLP scored on our website. I'll put that in the chat after the presentation. You probably did already see this, but what you may have noticed is that Concord actually was the top performer for this scorecard, which is, huge credit to all of you in Concord who are doing excellent work and excellent advocacy and encouraging your MLP to transition. But the way that you all did this is you scored 98 points out of the 100 points available. Again, there are 21 plus bonus points. And I will also just add that there was a close second with Belmont. They scored 97 points. So there is still competition for you all. This is just a summary of where Concord got its points. So you can see, 43 points came from energy transition, this area, 24 out of 25 from energy efficiency, 21 out of 15 for transparency and community engagement. And that is because there were substantial bonus points that you all earned. And then 10 out of 10 in policy context, again, with 2 extra bonus points that, so it's out of 12. So I think the takeaway here is, number one, Concord is doing really well. Number two, in every category, with the exception potentially for transparency and community engagement, and that's more to do with the methods than with transparency itself, there is still room for improvement. There are still points that can be gained, still efforts that should be made. And so I am going to spend the next portion of my presentation really discussing Concord's performance specifically in these categories. And I'm going to base it around the 7 conclusions that MCAN drew from this report in total. I'm going to, kind of state that conclusion, explain where Concord falls in that conclusion, and then come out with a few recommendations that you all can consider implementing, acting on, moving forward. And I will just say these are suggestions. They might not work perfectly for every single community, but they do provide a guideline, and a bit of a framework for how you all can move forward. So the first one, and this doesn't really have a recommendation, but we are finding that several MLPs are demonstrating leadership and ambition in energy transition and energy efficiency. And when we think about leaders, there is no question, and I'm sure you would not be surprised to learn that, as the highest ranking MLP, Concord is absolutely one of those leaders. And this is both compared to other municipal light plants and also investor-owned utilities. However, there is still a whole bunch of work that remains to be done, a whole lot of room to grow and continue to build on the progress that you all have already made. The second conclusion, and I'm not going to get into this in a whole bunch of detail, is that many MLPs have yet to recognize the importance of Class 1 renewable energy credits and specifically the retirement of those credits. And as such, they're not meeting the renewable portfolio standards. So very briefly, Class 1 renewable energy credits are essentially an environmental credit that an energy type receives if they are seen as clean and green. And so I'm thinking specifically of wind, solar, geothermal. Those are your main types. There are a whole list. And so in order to take credit for using that energy, you need to retire these RECs. That is what determines the percentage of clean energy in your energy mix. Now, when I talk about recognition of the importance of REC retirement, there are only 9 municipal light plants that are retiring Class 1 renewable energy credits, and a lot of them are not retiring them at the level that is required, that the rest of the state is retiring them. Concord, that is not the case in Concord. And, we saw that based on our calculations, which is slightly different from CMLP's calculations, just based on our methods, Concord had about 42.8% of their energy mix that was accounted for by clean energy. And this is really fantastic. It far exceeds the rest of the state, which in 2019, this is based on 2019 data. In 2019, I believe the rest of the state was really focused around 14%, excuse me. And so, this is showing that Concord is really leading the way in this regard in their percentage of clean energy. And this is something that you all should, keep this up, continue to lead, because you can then show other communities what's possible. The third conclusion that we drew is that many MLPs provide a wide variety of programs that support their residents in adopting clean energy technology. However, there is no question that some of these programs need to be strengthened if they're going to be effective in actually incentivizing residents, in their effort to transition to clean technology. So for this specific conclusion, we measured numerous programs. Some of them are shown here. We looked at whether or not MLPs were participating in the MLP solar rebate program offered by DOER, whether they had a net metering policy, whether or not they had an electric vehicle charging rebate, whether they were using advanced metering infrastructure, and whether they had a 100% clean energy opt-in program. This is essentially where, there's a different program that residents specifically can opt into. And as a result, more, class 1 RECs, renewable energy credits, are retired. And so again, from these specific programs, we found that CMLP offers all of these programs with the exception of the 100% clean energy opt-in program. Now, when we're thinking about strength of, and regarding the 100% clean energy program, there may be a reason for that. It could be associated. I know Concord has a very ambitious 100% clean energy target. And so again, this is where I say, maybe not all of these programs make sense for every single community. That was actually a bonus point. And so it's important to kind of keep that in mind. When we are talking about programs that could be strengthened to ensure that they are incentivizing clean energy adoption, one of the key policies that we looked at was net metering policies. And so we didn't only look at, does this MLP have a net metering policy or do they not? We also looked at, well, what is it made up of? And we looked at 3 specific characteristics. I'm not going to get into the details, but we did find that CMLP's net metering policy meets 2 of the 3, and they're seen here, related to limits both at an aggregate level and at a very, kind of on my house, can I have a system that is large enough to, address my energy needs, pretty consistently. And so Concord's net metering policy met those 2 characteristics that kind of measure that. One area where they, still could improve is in the net excess energy charge. And that is essentially the money or a fee that you receive when you produce too much energy, and that energy then goes back to the grid and is used by the MLP. We contend that this charge should be equal to the energy that you pay for, and the reason is because that factors into the economics of a resident, of a customer. If you have a higher charge, the economics are more likely going to work out for you to build solar, and we like solar. So, that's something where, 9 MLPs do have this charge that equals their energy rate. And this was not something that Concord had. This is slightly different from conclusion 3, but I do just want to mention it. Battery technology, at a utility scale, is really something that MLPs have been focusing on. And we've been really excited to see that 10 municipal light plants across the state have installed already utility scale battery technology. And this is really useful for increasing the amount of renewable energy that can be used, as an intermittent resource. You can then store this and it can be used for later. It also, is helpful for shaving, cleaning the peak, when energy demand is really high. You can then use some of the stored energy in your battery to offset the dirty energy and with clean renewable energy. And so we found that 10 MLPs are doing this. 4 of those 10 are already planning to install more battery technology. So this is, they're moving even further. As far as where CMLP is in this mix, they do not have this battery technology, but they did, say to MCAN, in our questionnaire, that they were planning to install battery technology. So this is one area specifically to look out for. And it's something that you all might be able to focus on. And, thinking about these recommendations specifically from conclusion 3, a few areas, that you all can continue to grow in, based on these results, if it kind of appeals to you, is strengthening net metering by increasing the excess generation charge that residents receive. This is something that we encourage every MLP to look at, but strengthening and expanding services that assist low and moderate income residents in this. It's not only about, do these programs exist, but, as Sarah was talking about, who do they serve and what is their impact, is really something that we encourage all MLP advocates to be thinking about and looking into. Finalizing and implementing plans to install utility scale batteries on an expedited timeline. The sooner we can get this technology out, the better. And then again, looking at adopting 100% clean energy opt-in programs. So those are a few recommendations. I'm going to move pretty quickly through the next couple, and I may actually skip one of the conclusions. I'm happy to go back to it if there are further questions, but on average, we found that the percentage of total revenue that MLPs spend on energy efficiency, so this is now getting to energy efficiency, is approximately 1/12 of the revenue percentage that investor-owned utilities allocate towards their energy efficiency program, Mass Save. Now, when thinking about this, that huge disparity, 1/12, Concord is a bit of an exception to that. We actually found that, your MLP allocates the largest percentage of your total revenue to energy efficiency programs and spending. So, we recorded you all as allocating about 2.8% of your total revenue to energy efficiency programs. This is really, really great. However, just to give you a sense of kind of where investor-owned utilities are at, they are required legally to spend. In 2019, they spent about 6.29% of their overall revenue. So, just because Concord is leading does not mean that there's still more room. Also, this comparison does also it includes some other funding sources for investor-owned utilities. So that disparity, cannot be explained solely through policies that an MLP is making, but just important to kind of understand, these differences. And so this investment has a real tangible impact on outcomes and on programs that can be offered. We monitored 7 different programs that relate specifically to energy efficiency. And we found that Concord provides 4 of those programs. The 3 programs that were not available when we, scored this were Energy Star rebates for efficient appliances, rebates for smart thermostats that help to control energy use, and then also 0% interest loans specifically for weatherization and heat pumps. Now, this could be a strategic decision by the MLP because we also did see that your MLP has larger incentives in heat pumps and in weatherization. And, these two programs specifically do help. They are really, really key when we think about increasing energy efficiency. And so spending there is really powerful and really beneficial. But there is still room to improve, based on what we saw. And so recommendations around energy efficiency is, continue to increase those incentives for weatherization and heat pumps. What we're seeing is that these rebates and incentives are being increased at the state level, for communities that are served by investor-owned utilities. So continue to look at, are these incentives enough to actually get residents, to transition and to use this technology and to weatherize their homes? And if not, let's continue to look at how we can fund them even more. Look at providing rebates for Energy Star appliances and smart thermostats. And then this is something that we're encouraging every MLP to look at. 0% interest loans are really critical, especially for low and moderate income residents who are looking at or interested in adopting heat pump technology or, weatherizing their homes. And so whether it be establishing this program specifically in your community or advocating for a statewide solution, this is something that we really see as beneficial. I'm going to skip this conclusion. I'm actually just going to go to the last conclusion because I think it's really important. As Sarah mentioned, justice and equity need to be at the center of policies and programs and operations. And so, when you all are looking at what efforts your MLP is doing, how they're engaging with the community, what steps they're taking, it is really important that you think about it through an equity and a justice lens. Who is being forgotten? Who is not at the table? And who is not being served by these policies, especially when we're thinking about addressing the climate crisis. We know that the best way to address the climate crisis is through also addressing and prioritizing environmental justice. And so, this is something that we will continue to do in our research, in our advocacy, and it's something that we strongly encourage other communities to think about. How can we implement this, not just on a one-off basis, but really structurally in your advocacy? And so with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen, and I think I'll open it up for questions.
Yeah.
Or Brad, I'll let you take it away.
So thank you so much, Logan and Sarah. That's a lot of information to digest. What we do is we would like to allow for 2 minutes of announcements first before we start the questions. And if you have a nice brief announcement of 30 seconds or less, I'd like you to raise your hand, and I'll call on you, and I'll wait a little bit of time just to see if anybody does that. Janet Miller.
I just wanted to announce that CSEC, the Sustainability and Energy Committee, is planning a sustainability series this spring. And the kickoff event is a presentation by Professor Kerry Emanuel. It's going to be on April the 27th. Kerry is a professor at MIT of atmospheric science, and sorry, I'm forgetting his absolute title, but anyway, it's going to probably be a hybrid presentation, so you can watch it on Zoom or go to a venue to hear the presentation.
Thank you.
If you want to add anything to that, Brad, please do.
Not at the moment. Anybody else? Okay. Anything else you want to announce can go in the chat. Okay, so let's go to questions and answers. I'm going to stop the recording. And